Your evidence won't touch my son!
Every burn mark already does.
The violation notice hit my chest before the smoke even cleared, the paper slapping against me like a verdict. I hadn't processed the smell of burned leather yet, or the twisted frame of what used to be my father's Rolls-Royce, before Valerie Storm stepped into the glow of the still smoldering embers. Her eyes held that familiar entitlement, the kind that told everyone she believed rules bent only for her. The heat on my face wasn't just from the fire, it was the humiliation she was banking on. She stood there, arms crossed, blocking the ruined driveway as if guarding a trophy. She didn't expect my response. She never does. I straightened, still staring at the ash-stained metal, and let the quiet truth cut through her performance. The ignition signature doesn't match a mechanical failure, I said, my voice steady. And the accelerant mark on the curb, that tells a different story. Her expression flickered, just barely. That tiny shift, half doubt, half panic, was the only breath of power I needed to feel the moment, because she had no idea who she was trying to intimidate. If you've ever felt that electric spark in your chest when you refuse to let bullies win, stay with me and hit subscribe now. She stepped closer again, regaining her stance, but I wasn't shrinking. I'm Marcus Ellington, I told her, calm and sure, letting the words settle between us. Automotive forensic engineering isn't just my job. It's the legacy my father built with his bare hands. Every car I inspected with him, every burn pattern he taught me to read. It's all right here in front of us. Her jaw tensed. The board chair wasn't used to residents with expertise she couldn't outvote. The longer I looked at the damaged car, the more something inside me tightened. That Rolls wasn't just a vehicle. It was the last project Dad and I worked on before he passed, the last bond we restored together. I kept it running because he couldn't, and I drove it because he never got the chance to. Seeing it in pieces on my own driveway felt like losing him all over again. But the worst part wasn't the destruction. It was how the enforcer in crimson tried to pretend none of it mattered. "You'll need to remove this immediately," she said, her voice cold, like she hadn't just watched part of my life burn. Behind her, the clipboard queen hovered near the sidewalk, already eyeing neighbors who peeked from windows. She wanted to control the narrative before truth formed its first breath. The tyrant in heels shifted her weight with impatience, tapping her shoe against the pavement as if my grief inconvenienced her schedule. And the officer of rules, the persona she wrapped herself in to justify everything, tightened her grip on that violation slip like it was a weapon. What she didn't realize was that the driveway told a story she couldn't erase. The char pattern trailing from the curb to the front tire, the melted streak near the gutter, the faint chemical smell that didn't belong to any engine fluid. I knew what I was looking at because this was what my father trained me to recognize. Deliberate fire. Directed fire. Fire meant to destroy something specific, but she wanted it gone before questions started. "Where are you watching from?" I asked the unseen audience that always forms in a neighborhood like this. People who stay silent until someone brave enough breaks the stillness. Even the air felt heavy with unfinished truth. I knelt beside the wheel well, ignoring Valerie's sigh behind me. My fingertips hovered a breath above the steel. There was a temperature differential, still warm in places it shouldn't be. That meant timing. That meant intent. That meant someone close enough to know when I wasn't home. My stomach dropped. This wasn't random, and the way the clipboard queen kept glancing toward her house, the way the enforcer in crimson kept positioning herself between me and the street, the way the officer of rules avoided making eye contact when I rose to my feet. Someone wasn't just hiding something. Someone felt responsible. And I intended to find out why. I didn't move when the last curl of smoke drifted upward. I kept my eyes on the melted edge of the fender, letting my silence unsettle the woman who thrived on control. Valerie Storm shifted first, just a slight adjustment of posture, but I caught it. For someone who claimed this was routine enforcement, she was far too nervous. The board chair lifted her chin, pretending authority would mask the tremor in her voice as she repeated her demand to have the car removed. I didn't answer. The more she talked, the more her tells revealed themselves. Darting glances, forced certainty, shallow breaths. Neighbors trickled onto porches, curtains twitched. Every person watching tried to understand whether this was another HOA power play or the unraveling of something far darker. The clipboard queen clutched her binder to her chest, flipping through pages that didn't matter. She wasn't looking for rules. She was buying time. The enforcer in crimson scanned the street like she expected someone to intervene. She wasn't usually afraid of an audience, so why now? And why this much desperation? I stepped back, examining the scorch marks on the pavement. The tyrant in heels tightened her jaw when she caught me looking. "That pattern is directional," I murmured, half to myself, half to her. She tried to ignore the comment, but her reaction was instant, a stiffening in her shoulders, a quick swallow. The officer of rules never had this much trouble dismissing a resident's concern. She usually thrived on conflict, but today she seemed unsettled. "This wasn't an accident," I said quietly, tracing the shape of the burn with my eyes. "Someone wanted it to." "Spread!" A murmur rippled through the onlookers. A few neighbors stepped closer, driven more by concern than gossip. One man whispered something to his wife, and she covered her mouth as she stared at the destroyed luxury car. I recognized the look, fear mixed with disbelief. Fires don't start like this in quiet, gated communities, not unless someone intended them to. My phone buzzed. Marcia's name flashed across the screen. I didn't answer. Not yet. My sister would be frantic when she heard what happened, especially knowing what that car symbolized. I needed clarity before I dragged her into this. "Marcus," a soft voice called from behind. It belonged to Mrs. Hargrove, the retired history teacher who lived 2 doors down. She stepped toward me cautiously, wringing her hands. I heard a loud bang. Around midnight, I thought it was fireworks at first. She hesitated before adding, "But there were footsteps, 2 people running." Her eyes flicked nervously toward Valerie. The board chair's expression tightened. So did her stance. "Did you report it?" I asked gently. "No," she whispered. "I didn't want trouble." The clipboard queen stepped between us instantly, offering a strained smile. "Let's avoid spreading unfounded rumors," she said. "We don't need panic." I cut her off with nothing more than a stare. Her confidence faltered, and she slipped back beside the enforcer in crimson. I crouched again, close enough to smell the chemicals still hovering in the air. My fingertips hovered just above the pavement. Heat lingered in unnatural spots. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting my training take over. The moisture evaporation pattern, the consistent spread, the absence of oil residue. It all pointed to a specific type of accelerant, a cheap one teenagers had easy access to. A sick feeling curled in my stomach. "Who was out last night?" I asked quietly, not accusing, just piecing together the scene. The tyrant in heels stiffened, sharply, visibly. That reaction told me more than any confession could. And before I could speak again, a sudden presence approached from the far end of the street. Officer Jenna Rowe, the conflicted witness I hadn't met yet, stepped out of her patrol car. Her walk was steady, but her expression gave away her uncertainty. She'd clearly been called by someone trying to get ahead of the narrative. Her eyes swept the driveway, the scorch marks, then Valerie, then me. Something flickered behind them. Recognition, hesitation, unease. She wasn't just here to take notes. She was caught between truth and politics, and she knew it. "What exactly happened here?" she asked, though her voice carried the weight of someone already doubting the story she'd been told. The board chair answered too quickly. I answered too calmly. And in that clash, something shifted. Officer Rowe realized this wasn't a simple incident. This was the beginning of a fracture in Ridgewood Bluffs, one that would expose more than a burned Rolls-Royce. Officer Jenna Rowe stood there longer than necessary, her gaze drifting between the burned luxury frame and the woman trying desperately to sanitize the scene. Valerie Storm wasn't subtle about it. She angled her body just enough to block the scorch path leading toward her own driveway. The board chair's smile was tight, brittle, and designed for onlookers, not for truth. But Jenna noticed. Her eyes flicked to that exact spot, then quickly away, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to acknowledge what she'd seen. "Officer, the homeowner failed to comply with neighborhood vehicle placement regulations." The enforcer in crimson insisted, her voice sharp and rehearsed. It sounded ridiculous even to her own ears, but she pressed on, hoping quick authority would drown out doubt. Jenna didn't respond. Instead, her attention lingered on me, and then on the charred asphalt. Her internal conflict was almost visible, jaw tightening, shoulders stiffening, fingers tapping against her belt, as though each tap counted the rules she was supposed to follow, and the truth she didn't want to ignore. The fire didn't originate inside the engine compartment, I said evenly. Look at the spread. The arc travels from the street inward. My finger traced the general direction without touching the still warm pavement. The clipboard queen exhaled sharply, shifting her binder behind her as if hiding something inside it. Jenna's gaze narrowed. The tyrant in heels moved subtly, planting herself between Jenna and the curb. That tiny gesture told me everything. If there was innocence on her side, she wouldn't need to obstruct her own patrol officer's view. Jenna took a small step sideways, just enough to reclaim her line of sight, and that forced meeting of angles made the officer of rules freeze. Valerie's lips parted, not in threat, but in calculation. She realized Jenna wasn't fully under her influence. Not today, not in a moment this obvious. Were there any witnesses? Jenna asked softly. Her tone was careful, intentionally neutral, but her brows pulled together in that faint pinch that translates to, "This doesn't add up." Mrs. Hargrove hesitated behind me, clutching her robe tighter. I felt her fear before she spoke. "I heard running," she whispered, but before she could continue, the enforcer in crimson cut in with a forced laugh that cracked at the edges. "Probably raccoons," she said, waving her hand as though erasing the memory entirely. Jenna didn't smile. I watched her inhale deeply, her gaze drifting back to the rolls. Her eyes traced the same burn pattern I had followed earlier. She wasn't a forensics expert, but she wasn't blind either. Her body language betrayed her. A brief pause, lips pressed into a thin line, shoulders drawing inward. She understood something. She just wasn't ready to say it. "Did the HOA contact you?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Her eyes flicked to Valerie. The board chair flinched. "I was dispatched," Jenna replied carefully. Another glance, another silent message. She didn't want to lie, but she also didn't want to wage war against the HOA on the spot. The clipboard queen cleared her throat, stepping forward like a shield. "Officer Rowe, the community prefers minimal public disturbance. We'd appreciate quick resolution." Jenna held up a hand, halting her mid-sentence. A bold move. And that's when I saw the real fracture, small but growing. The officer was done being spoken over. Her allegiance was cracking under the weight of what she was seeing. "Let me document the scene," Jenna said, reaching for her camera. "No need," the tyrant in heels snapped. Her voice was too sharp, too urgent, too telling. Jenna froze, blinking. There it was. The moment her internal struggle fully surfaced, her shoulders squared, but her eyes softened with something almost like apology. She wasn't choosing sides yet, but she had taken her first step away from blind HOA obedience. "Officer Rowe," I said quietly, "just look at the curb." She hesitated. Then her foot shifted, half an inch, maybe less, but enough for her gaze to lower toward the scorch trail, enough for her to see what she already suspected. Her breath caught. That reaction, the smallest inhale, was all the confirmation I needed. She knew. She just wasn't ready to admit it aloud. And the moment she lifted her eyes again, meeting mine with that heavy, conflicted look, I understood something else. This officer was about to become far more important than anyone standing on that driveway realized. Officer Jenna Rose stepped back toward her patrol car, pretending to retrieve something, but I saw the real reason for her distance. She needed space to process what she'd just witnessed. Her internal conflict was a living thing now, tightening her shoulders and slowing her steps. She'd seen enough burn patterns at accident sites to recognize when a story didn't match the evidence, and nothing about this scene matched what Valerie Storm and her circle were pushing. The board chair sensed Jenna slipping out of her influence, and panic flickered like static beneath her polished exterior. She quickly shifted into her next tactic, escalation. "Marcus Ellington is in violation of Section 4, she announced loudly, projecting her voice so every neighbor on their porch could hear. The enforcer in crimson stepped beside her, mimicking authority like a practiced routine. It was a performance designed to drown out the truth with rules and intimidation. "Section 4 doesn't apply to burned vehicles," I said quietly. "It applies to non-operational cars stored for more than 72 hours. I knew the bylaws better than she expected. The clipboard queen tightened her grip on her binder like she wished she could fold herself inside it. "Valerie's Expression twitched before she quickly recovered. "It applies," she snapped. "I enforce it." The tyrant in heels crossed her arms sharply, the motion stiff and defensive. She wasn't used to being questioned, let alone challenged publicly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "You can't find me for evidence?" That single word made her flinch. Evidence meant investigation. Investigation meant accountability. And accountability was something the officer of rules worked tirelessly to avoid. Her jaw clenched. "You will remove it today." The demand wasn't just unreasonable, it was strategic. If the car disappeared, so did the burn pattern, the accelerant traces, and every physical clue tying the fire to human hands rather than mechanical failure. She needed the driveway clean before the truth solidified. "No," I said softly. The refusal cut deeper than shouting could. Neighbors leaned forward. Even Jenna paused mid-step. The board chair stepped closer, her voice dropping. "This neighborhood doesn't tolerate drama." She meant your drama. She meant your presence. She meant the inconvenience of your truth. It wasn't the first time I'd felt it. It wouldn't be the last. I bent down again, my eyes following the arc of melted asphalt. The enforcer in crimson tensed as if she could physically block my attention. The scorch path was unmistakable now that morning light revealed it fully. Every detail told a deliberate story. Fuel poured from a handheld container, ignited from the curb, flames climbing inward toward the Rolls-Royce like a guided attack. "Someone tried to destroy more than a car," I said, standing slowly. "They tried to erase a legacy." A hush settled. Even wind seemed to pause. Marcia's call buzzed again. I still didn't answer. Not because I didn't want her comfort, but because I needed clarity before I broke down the truth for her. Dad's last restoration was gone. The last piece of him that still moved with me on the road. The last thing he ever touched, and someone did it on purpose. Valerie's reaction to my words was too quick, too sharp. "You're overreacting," she insisted. "Cars catch fire." The clipboard queen nodded with her like a bobblehead on command. But the officer of rules overplayed her hand. She couldn't hide how badly she needed the crowd to believe her version. Officer Rose stepped closer again. "Let me confirm a few details," she said. Her voice held more steel than before. The shift in her posture was subtle, but irreversible. She was aligning herself with truth, not politics. Valerie immediately intercepted her. "Officer, please, let's not waste county resources. This was mechanical." Jenna's eyes narrowed just slightly. "I'll determine that." The tyrant in heels attempted a smile, brittle and strained. Sweat gathered near her temple despite the cool air. She was unraveling. "What time did you last see the car intact?" Jenna asked. "Around 9, I answered. "And you weren't home after that?" "No." Valerie interrupted again. "The community gate camera shows no suspicious activity. Too fast, too rehearsed, too intentional." Jenna turned her full focus on the board chair. "You checked the cameras already?" "A beat too long." "I had them reviewed." "By who? When? Why?" The tension snapped. The moment truth began leaning my direction. Someone wasn't just hiding something. Someone was desperate to keep me from finding who poured the accelerant that destroyed my father's car. And as Jenna's pen finally touched her notepad, I knew she was starting to see it too. Officer Jenna Rowe didn't move for a moment after she questioned the gate camera claim. Her pen hovered above the page, eyes fixed on Valerie Storm, with a concentration that made the board chair shift uncomfortably. It was the first time I'd seen the enforcer in crimson lose her balance in front of an audience. She looked for an escape path, some loophole, some technicality, but every attempt at composure cracked around the edges. That alone told me the discovery I was heading toward was going to shake her foundation. I stepped away from the charred driveway and into the street, needing distance to think. The clipboard queen followed my movements with her nervous eyes, gripping her binder so tight the edges bent. She wasn't just anxious, she was scared of something specific, something the tyrant in heels didn't want anyone to see. The neighborhood was quiet except for murmurs from porches. I crouched near the gutter, tracing the faint runoff pattern again. The officer of rules tried to shout something about interfering with an HOA investigation, but her voice wavered. She didn't approach me. She didn't dare. The discovery method for this part was pure professional expertise. No files, no basements, no documents. just the truth lying on the ground, waiting for someone who knew how to read it. The burn pattern wasn't random. The arc hit the gutter, dipped, then re-emerged several feet down. That only happened when someone poured an accelerant quickly, panicked, splashing instead of pouring clean lines. And based on that uneven flow, the culprit wasn't experienced. They were sloppy, inexperienced, likely young. I swallowed hard. Teenagers, and not just any. Someone with access to this street without cameras seeing them. Someone who lived here. My chest tightened as I followed the pattern toward the cul-de-sac. The scorch marks became fainter, but still detectable. The enforcer in crimson noticed where I was heading and stepped forward abruptly, blocking my path with a forced casual stance. "Stay off private property," she snapped. "I'm on a public roadway," I replied. The clipboard queen whispered something to her. The tyrant in heels shot her a warning look, then turned back toward me, trying to reel me back with empty authority. But I walked around her, refusing to be redirected. The officer of rule's voice rose again, brittle and frantic, but I hardly heard her. My focus was on the faint, darkened specks leading toward one driveway. Her driveway. The driveway belonging to the very woman who'd tried everything to silence questions. I stopped at the edge of Valerie Storm's property line. The enforcer in crimson rushed toward me, but not fast enough to hide what lay near her trash bin, tiny blackened clumps, barely visible unless you knew how to identify them. Accelerant-soaked cotton fibers. They don't burn completely unless exposed to sustained high heat. They survive just enough to tell the truth. I exhaled slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. Someone used a makeshift wick. Someone who didn't understand how accelerants behaved. Someone who thought a little flame and some soaked cloth scraps were enough to destroy a car without anyone noticing how it started. I straightened, and when I looked up, I found Valerie Storm frozen mid-step. Her lips parted, and for the first time, genuine fear flashed across her face. Not fear of me. Fear of the consequences the HOA couldn't bury. Officer Rowe's voice cut through the tension. "Marcus, what did you find?" I didn't answer right away. I crouched again, studying the charred debris. "Someone tried to ignite the accelerant using cotton," I said. I heard a sharp inhale behind me, one of the neighbors who understood what that implied. "Kids use it," I added. "Teenagers. They don't know how controlled ignition works. They improvise." Valerie's reaction was immediate, desperate. "Plenty of people walk through here," she insisted, her voice pitching higher. "Trash blows around. You can't assume." "I'm not assuming," I said quietly. "I'm analyzing." Officer Rose stepped closer, her patrol boots crunching lightly against the pavement. "These fibers shouldn't be on this property unless someone brought them here." The clipboard queen swallowed hard, her knuckles whitening. The tyrant in heels looked everywhere but at her own driveway. The officer of rules finally broke. "This is circumstantial," she hissed, but her voice cracked, betraying everything she wanted to hide. I stood slowly, dusting my palms on my jeans. The neighborhood held its breath. Even the breeze felt tense. "This wasn't just arson," I said. "This was done by someone who panicked, someone who ran, someone who didn't think anyone would understand what they left behind." Valerie stepped back, her confidence crumbling like ash. And in that moment, I knew the truth. This wasn't about the HOA. This was about her family. And her son had just become the prime suspect. The moment the realization surfaced, that this wasn't an adult's work but a teenager's panic, the air around us thickened. Valerie Storm must have felt it too, because she moved with sudden urgency, positioning herself between Officer Rowe and the tiny charred fibers near her trash bin. The motion was instinctive, protective, not of truth, but of someone she loved. The board chair wasn't defending HOA rules anymore. She was shielding something far more fragile. "Officer Rowe, this area isn't relevant," she insisted, voice trembling despite her attempt at composure. The enforcer in crimson tried to imitate authority, stepping into a defensive stance, heels digging into the driveway. I noticed the flicker in her eyes, the same flicker she'd displayed all morning, fear disguised as irritation. But Jenna wasn't buying the performance. Her internal struggle hadn't vanished, but something in her had quietly shifted toward purpose. She approached slowly, hands on her belt, gaze scanning the driveway with measured suspicion. Everything on this property is relevant, she said, calm, firm, unshakable. The clipboard queen whispered frantically to Valerie, but the tyrant in heels snapped at her without looking, her patience cracking. The officer of rules attempted to regain control, tossing out threats about HOA codes, but her voice quivered enough to make several neighbors exchange glances. They weren't seeing authority anymore. They were witnessing collapse. I crouched again, not touching the debris, but observing the spread of soot across the pavement. The fibers were only part of the story. The heat signature on the concrete lingered in uneven patches, partially shielded during ignition by something small, like a metal container or a shoe. And that mismatch between flame height and burn pattern meant something else. The fire had been started by someone standing too close, someone who didn't understand flashback risks, someone who acted impulsively. I rose slowly, letting the weight of the discovery settle across the circle of onlookers. "These fibers aren't from a rag," I said, addressing the crowd as much as I addressed Jensen. "They're from cut shirt material, common in teenage DIY fire attempts. The burn pattern confirms someone stayed long enough for the flame to take, then panicked when it grew too fast." A gasp came from somewhere near Mrs. Hargrove. She covered her mouth, eyes widening toward Valerie's house. The reaction didn't go unnoticed. Valerie stepped forward sharply. "You don't know anything about my family," she snapped. Her voice wasn't just defensive, it was terrified. That fear hit harder than any confession could. "I never mentioned your family," I replied softly. The enforcer in crimson froze. The clipboard queen dropped her gaze. The tyrant in heels swallowed hard, and even the officer of rules, always so sure of her power, took a shaky step back. And Jenna watched them all, her eyes narrowing with growing clarity. "What time did your household return home last night?" she asked, directing the question squarely at Valerie. The board chair stiffened. "That's not relevant." "It is now," Jenna said. Her tone didn't waver. She'd crossed an invisible line, choosing integrity over HOA protection. I could feel the tension climbing, stretching tight across the street like a drawn wire. This was the turning point, where the stakes deepened, where the truth began closing in on the person who'd set this entire disaster in motion. "My son was home all night," Valerie answered quickly, too quickly. The clipboard queen flinched. The enforcer in crimson looked down. The tyrant in heels clenched her fists. The officer of rules blinked rapidly, and Jenna caught every tell. "What time did he go to bed?" the officer asked. "Early," Valerie said. "What time is early?" "When teenagers normally sleep." The shaky vagueness told its own story. I stepped forward, my voice low but steady. "The accelerant trail starts at the curb. Whoever ignited it walked from the street toward your driveway." I pointed gently, no theatrics, no accusation, just truth guided by expertise. Someone panicked, someone ran, and someone left evidence behind they didn't know how to hide. Valerie's composure fractured. Tiny cracks of fear spread through her expression, pieces of truth slipping out through her trembling breath. "You're twisting things," she whispered. "No," I said. "I'm reading them." Jenna took another step toward the fibers, then toward Valerie. Her voice softened, but her words carried weight. "If someone in your home has information, you need to be honest. Interference at this stage becomes obstruction." Valerie's eyes filled, not with remorse, but with dread. She wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid of what came next. Her son wasn't simply implicated. He was trapped in the very evidence the neighborhood had just witnessed. And for the first time, the board chair understood. This wasn't a homeowner dispute. This was the beginning of a federal-level fire investigation, one that would expose everything she'd tried to bury. Officer Jenna Rowe didn't speak right away. She watched Valerie storm with a depth of caution that hadn't been there earlier, a quiet, deliberate calculation that signaled a shift in her internal compass. The board chair sensed it immediately. Her breath shortened, her posture tightened, and her eyes darted from Jenna to me as if trying to anticipate which direction the truth would take. The enforcer in crimson lingered at her side, but offered no reassurance. Even she looked rattled by the growing cracks in their story. Jenna finally exhaled and stepped closer, not to Valerie, but to me. "Marcus," she said softly, "I need you to hear something before this goes any further." Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her tension. Her thumb tapped against her notepad in a rhythm too uneven to be calm. This was the moment defined in the outline, the conflicted witness stepping into the light. The clipboard queen straightened, eyes widening with alarm. She knew what was happening. She felt control slipping. The tyrant in heels took a half step forward as though physically blocking the officer might somehow stop the truth from surfacing. And the officer of rules, she simply froze, staring at Jenna with a warning buried deep behind her eyes. But Jenna didn't look away. "I didn't want to assume anything," she said, her voice low. "But earlier today, before I came here, I got a call." Valerie tensed like a wire pulled too tight. "From whom?" I asked. Jenna hesitated. Her gaze flicked toward the onlookers. Neighbors clustered on porches, hands over mouths, eyes wide with curiosity and dread. She swallowed, then moved slightly closer so only a handful of us could hear. "It was an anonymous tip about a fire on Oakshire Lane," she said. The caller sounded young, panicked, told dispatch that a car was burning and someone needed to check before the flames spread. My heart pounded once, hard. "Young?" I repeated. She nodded. "Very. Teenager young." The enforcer in crimson's breath hitched. "And the weird part," Jenna continued, "is that the caller hung up the second I asked for their name. I reviewed the call on my way here, and something about their breathing, the way they stumbled over words. It didn't sound like someone reporting an accident." Her eyes shifted pointedly toward Valerie's home. "It sounded like someone confessing without wanting to confess." Valerie's composure shattered almost invisibly, a twitch at her jawline, a flicker at the corner of her mouth. The clipboard queen whispered her name in warning, but she didn't respond. The tyrant in heels pressed her lips together in a tight, trembling line. Jenna kept going, her courage gaining momentum. "When you walked toward this driveway earlier, Marcus, and saw those fibers." The caller's voice came back to me. It matched the panic, the fear, and the timing lined up almost perfectly. The officer of rules finally snapped. "Stop talking," she hissed, but her voice cracked and her hand shook when she raised it. "You don't have proof." Jenna cut her off with a single look, and that was when I realized the shift was complete. The conflicted witness had taken her stand. She wasn't only observing now, she was helping. "I checked dispatch logs," Jenna continued. "The call came from a number registered to this residence." Her voice stayed level, controlled. "The call bounced towers long enough for me to verify the route." The crowd gasped. Mrs. Hargrove pressed her trembling fingers to her lips. Valerie staggered a half step back, like the ground had tilted beneath her. The enforcer in crimson grabbed her arm, but the board chair shook her off. Her eyes darted wildly now, not toward the truth but toward exits, escape routes, explanations she didn't have. "You don't know who made that call," she said weakly. "Lots of people could have used—" "The number wasn't spoofed," Jenna said, "and minors don't spoof numbers." The clipboard queen looked like she might faint. My pulse hammered against my ribs as the final barrier crumbled. Jenna swallowed hard, then delivered the confession she'd been holding back. "Marcus, I think your arson suspect called 911 themselves. I think they panicked when the flames got out of control, and I think they didn't want anyone to get hurt." The implication snapped across the street like a wire under tension. Her son. Valerie Storm closed her eyes, a single tear escaping before she wiped it away with shaking fingers. The truth had broken through. Her empire of rules was collapsing, and now everyone watching knew the same thing. The board chair wasn't just hiding misconduct. She was hiding a crime committed by her own child. And that was the moment the real battle began. The moment Officer Rowe revealed the anonymous caller's number was tied to Valerie Storm's home. The entire street shifted. Neighbors leaned in. Conversations died mid-breath. Even the breeze felt stunned. The board chair didn't speak. She couldn't. Her polished authority cracked like thin glass under a heavy truth she could no longer outrun. The enforcer in crimson hovered protectively beside her, but even she looked unsure, as though instinct warned her that this time, shielding the queen wouldn't work. I felt something colder settle inside me. Not anger, not even relief, but a sharpened sense of purpose. This wasn't about humiliation anymore. This was about accountability. And if the HOA wasn't going to confront the truth, I would build the path myself. I stepped back toward the charred driveway, letting my eyes study every detail under the shifting morning light. The clipboard queen flinched as I crouched near the asphalt, her binder held tighter, knuckles white around the edges. She kept glancing at Valerie, waiting for direction that never came. The tyrant in heels seemed frozen between fury and fear, one heel tapping restlessly against concrete, a nervous tell I hadn't seen before. The officer of rules finally dropped her pretense. Her shoulders sagged, her practiced confidence erased. Jenna watched them all before turning to me. "What's your next move?" she asked quietly. "Mine?" I rose slowly, brushing soot from my palms. "Simple. I document everything." The enforcer in crimson hissed under her breath, but her outrage didn't matter. I wasn't asking for permission. "Economic pressure works only when truth is undeniable," I continued, keeping my voice steady. "Insurance agencies won't touch a case built on speculation. They need evidence. And if the HOA wants to pretend nothing happened here, then I'll make sure every trace of this fire speaks for itself." It wasn't about revenge. It was about accuracy, precision, facts, everything I was trained for. I pulled my phone out and began recording the site, not for social media, but for data. Angles, temperature inconsistencies, the exact shape of the burn arc, the cotton fibers near the curb. Jenna leaned in, watching with a kind of respect I wasn't expecting. "You're doing this like a forensic sweep," she murmured. "That's exactly what it is." And I was just getting started. The clipboard queen stepped forward nervously. "Is that necessary?" she stammered. "We can handle this internally." "We?" I asked. "Or the HOA?" Her cheeks flushed, and she looked down. "No internal committee will erase what happened here," I continued. "Not when liability is this high. A structure fire, near a home, near neighbors' property lines. Insurance doesn't play with numbers that big." The officer of rules swallowed hard. She knew exactly what those numbers meant. If the HOA was connected to this, even indirectly, they could face astronomical penalties, assessments, lawsuits, federal investigation escalations. And suddenly, the facade of authority she carried felt much heavier on her shoulders. "That's enough," Valerie finally whispered. Her voice trembled. "Stop intimidating my family." "Intimidation?" I echoed softly. "No, accountability." The enforcer in crimson bristled, but Jenna stepped between us, placing herself directly in Valerie's path. For the first time, the conflicted witness wasn't conflicted at all. "I need to see the inside of your trash bin," Jenna said to her. Valerie's eyes widened. "Absolutely not. That wasn't a request." Silence cracked across the street like thunder. The tyrant in heels clutched her arms around her body. The clipboard queen looked away. The officer of rules whispered Valerie's name in warning, but Jenna wasn't backing down. "Any evidence connected to an active fire investigation is subject to examination. If you refuse, I'll call for a warrant." The board chair stared at her, disbelief mixing with panic. "You're overstepping." "No," Jenna replied. "You are." I watched the internal war play across Valerie's features, pride battling fear, authority clashing with maternal instinct. She wasn't protecting HOA rules anymore. She was protecting her son from consequences she knew were coming. "This is harassment," she whispered. "This is procedure," Jenna corrected. I knelt again, inspecting the fibers from a new angle. "And when insurers see this," I said softly, "they'll classify it as intentional ignition. That triggers federal reporting, mandatory, and the fines." I shook my head slowly. "They don't stop at thousands." The clipboard queen's breath caught. "The starting point," I continued, "is 7 million. A gasp, sharp and collective, rippled through the neighborhood. The enforcer in crimson staggered. The officer of rules pressed a hand to her forehead. Even Mrs. Hargrove whispered a frantic prayer. Under her breath, Valerie's face drained of color, because now she understood the reality fully. Her HOA couldn't shield her. Her arrogance couldn't protect her. Her silence couldn't save her son. The financial avalanche had already started, and I was just beginning to push. The neighborhood felt different now, charged, unsettled, bracing for impact. The moment I mentioned the $7 million starting point for federal restitution, Valerie's storm folded inward like someone had yanked the threads keeping her upright. The board chair stood rigid at the edge of her driveway, chin trembling despite her effort to hold it high. The enforcer in crimson hovered beside her, but her posture lacked its usual sharpness. Fear had dulled her edges. Even the clipboard queen kept her binder against her chest like a flimsy shield. Their empire of authority had begun crumbling, and everyone knew it. I shifted my focus back to the burned remains of my father's car. This part, the preparation phase, required precision. Every detail mattered, not just for the emotional weight it carried, but for the strategy I'd chosen. Economic pressure was the one method people like Valerie couldn't manipulate, intimidate, or outvote. Numbers didn't bow to social standing. Fees didn't care about HOA pedigree. Liability didn't bend for arrogance. I crouched again, studying the faint scorch variations near the bumper. Officer Rowe moved beside me, careful, deliberate. "Walk me through it," she said quietly. "I intend to," I replied, lowering my voice as the crowd leaned in again. "This isn't just about how the fire started. It's about how the consequences unfold." The officer of rules stiffened, her voice breaking the air in a brittle demand. "You're not an investigator." "No," I said. "I'm the victim, and I'm documenting my property for insurance." Her mouth snapped shut. She knew I was within my rights. The tyrant in heels stepped forward, trying to reclaim the facade of control. "You're blowing this out of proportion. A simple incident." "It wasn't simple," I pointed to the pavement. "Look at the splash pattern. Uneven ignition, sudden backdraft." I let the details speak, not my anger. Whoever lit it didn't expect it to spread so fast. They panicked. A nervous shift rippled through the onlookers. "And when people panic," I continued, rising slowly, "they make mistakes." Valerie's son wasn't outside, not yet. But every move she made screamed maternal fear. She stepped closer, her voice cracking. "Leave my family out of this." "I haven't mentioned your family," I replied evenly. The board chair swallowed hard. The enforcer in crimson squeezed her shoulder. The clipboard queen backed up another step, retreating into silence. And the officer of rules tried to mask her worry with feigned indignation, but none of them were convincing anymore. Jenna pulled out her evidence, bag and nodded toward the fibers near the trash bin. "I need to collect these." "You're not touching anything on this property," Valerie snapped, instinctively blocking access again. "That's obstruction," Jenna said, "and you know it." The neighborhood gasped. A few phones lifted discreetly. The shift in public loyalty was immediate and irreversible. I didn't want a mob. I wanted accountability. And the best way to secure that was to prepare every shred of evidence for insurance review, federal reporting, and liability assessment. My preparation wasn't just investigative, it was strategic pressure. I moved toward my porch this time, where my toolkit sat untouched. It wasn't for repair, it was for measurement. Temperature gauge, moisture meter, angle finder. Not a garage file or hidden document, just my training, my knowledge, and the tools I'd earned over a lifetime. "This is the preparation phase," I murmured to myself, "and they can't stop it." The clipboard queen finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Is federal involvement guaranteed?" I looked at her, not cruelly, but truthfully. If an accelerant was used intentionally, yes. And when a minor is involved, penalties multiply. The truth landed heavy across the cul-de-sac. The tyrant in heels muttered a curse under her breath. The officer of rules paced, rubbing her temples. The enforcer in crimson looked like she might faint. And Valerie Storm, for the first time since stepping onto my driveway that morning, looked small, stripped of power, stripped of pretense, stripped of the armor she'd worn for years. "This isn't about destroying you," I said quietly. "It's about uncovering the truth. Your son needs help before the consequences get even worse." She shook her head slowly, tears threatening. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I answered. "And that's why I'm preparing everything properly. No shortcuts, no silence." Jenna leaned closer. "Marcus," she said softly, "if you have more tools or knowledge we can use, now is the time." I nodded. Because this was the moment the strategy solidified. This was where preparation turned into pressure. This was where the HOA would face the unavoidable consequences of the fire they tried to bury. And as I lifted my toolkit and walked back toward the smoldering remains, the neighborhood realized something unmistakable. The real confrontation hadn't even started yet. I carried my toolkit back toward the ruined driveway, the weight of it grounding me in a moment that was no longer about grief alone. It was about positioning, Preparation had shifted into execution, and judging from the way Valerie Storm watched me, arms stiff at her sides, she knew it too. The board chair stood like a fortress, cracking under pressure, her gaze darting from my tools to Officer Rowe, as though calculating which threat would break her defenses first. The Watts enforcer in crimson hovered uneasily behind her, her usual swagger replaced by an almost trembling alertness. She kept glancing at the scorch pattern I'd mapped out earlier, as if hoping it would magically rearrange itself into something innocent. The clipboard queen clutched her binder with both arms now, whispering frantic half-formed sentences under her breath. And the tyrant in heels. She'd begun pacing, a plea buried somewhere beneath her cracking facade. But none of their performances mattered anymore. The strategy was already in motion. Jenna stepped closer, her patrol boots crunching against bits of char and debris. "You're moving into the formal stage now, aren't you?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. "Everything from this point on goes into official documentation. Photos, angles, heat differentials, burn progression, fiber analysis." I lowered my voice as I leaned down again. "Once I send this to insurance, they'll open a full arson inquiry. That alone triggers cross-reporting to federal systems." The officer of rules let out a sound somewhere between a gasp and a choke. "You're blowing this out of proportion." "No," I said calmly. "Someone poured accelerant near my home. That's not proportion. That's reality." Neighbors edged closer to the sidewalk, their faces pale with tension. Some clutched coffee mugs with shaking hands. Others held phones discreetly but steadily. The confrontation had drawn them out, but the strategy was what held them there now. "Marcus," Jenna said, kneeling beside me, "walk me through this like you would in a professional investigation." The enforcer in crimson stiffened, as if Jenna had just flipped a switch she couldn't control. "Gladly," I replied. I pointed to the first scorch mark. "This flame spread upward, not outward. That means ignition was low and intentional. And this," I angled my temperature gauge toward a darker patch, "shows delayed burn. Something shielded this point temporarily." "What kind of something?" Jenna asked. "A metal object, small, pocket-sized. Maybe a lighter dropped too close during the panic." The clipboard queen flinched so visibly it drew every head toward her. "And here," I continued, moving a few feet to the left, "you can see the accelerant drip pattern, uneven, inconsistent, not poured from height, fumbled. That's common in inexperienced arson attempts." The tyrant in heels stopped pacing altogether, her lips pressed together as though swallowing a confession she'd never dare speak. "And when you combine all that," I said, locking eyes with Valerie, "plus the fibers found near your trash bin, plus the anonymous teenage-sounding call from your home," the board chair's breath trembled, "you get a case that no insurance adjuster can ignore. And the moment they confirm intentional ignition, liability skyrockets." "How high?" the officer of rules whispered. "High enough to bankrupt an HOA," I said evenly. "High enough to force federal oversight. High enough to bring investigators to every property connected to the suspect." Valerie closed her eyes. "Stop," she whispered. "Just stop." "I can't," I said softly. "Because once the federal system is involved, stopping isn't an option." The enforcer in crimson grabbed the board chair's arm. "We should go inside," she murmured, but Valerie didn't move. She looked too hollow, too drained, almost suspended between collapsing and clinging to her last shred of control. Jenna stood, dusting her hands on her uniform. "Marcus, once you finish your analysis, I can submit my preliminary report. It won't be conclusive, but it'll support your insurance filing." "Good," I said, "because that filing activates the mandatory escalation." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. "What escalation?" the clipboard queen asked, voice cracking. I lifted my phone, scrolling toward the form I'd already drafted. "When intentional fire damage is suspected," I said, "insurance companies are required to report the incident to the National Fire Investigation Database, and cases involving minors." I raised my eyes, meeting Valerie's trembling stare. "Incur enhanced penalties." Her fear finally surfaced in a visible tremor. This wasn't HOA territory anymore. This was federal territory. And she knew it. I knelt one last time, taking a final measurement of the debris near her property line. Everything was aligning, every detail, every inconsistency, every fractured lie. This wasn't just a burned car. This was a financial earthquake waiting to hit Ridgewood Bluffs. And I was placing the final piece that would bring the truth into the open. The community center was packed, every seat filled, every wall lined, every hallway overflowing with residents who normally avoided HOA meetings like the plague. But not tonight. Tonight was different. Tonight, they weren't here for petty disputes or landscaping guidelines. They were here for the truth about the fire, and for accountability the neighborhood had been denied for years. At the front of the room, Valerie Storm sat rigid in her usual seat of authority, but the board chair looked nothing like the woman who once ruled Ridgewood Bluffs with unshakable certainty. Her posture was stiff, her grip on the wooden armrests trembled, and her eyes refused to meet mine. The enforcer in crimson sat beside her, shoulders hunched, sweat beading near her hairline. The clipboard queen kept flipping through blank pages of her binder, as if hoping words would magically appear. And the tyrant in heels, usually unyielding, had kicked her shoes off beneath the table, pressing her bare toes into the carpet like she needed grounding. The officer of rules tried to maintain dignity, but her twitching jaw betrayed the collapse brewing beneath her stern facade. The crowd quieted when I stepped forward. The shift was instant, the silence heavy, charged with anticipation. They weren't looking at a victim, they were looking at someone carrying truth into a room built on control. I felt their expectation like weight on my shoulders, but I welcomed it. I wasn't here to entertain. I was here to finish what had been building since the first spark hit my driveway. Our agenda tonight, the clipboard queen began shakily, is truth, someone from the back called out. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The clipboard queen swallowed hard and lowered her gaze. She wasn't leading tonight. Officer Jenna Rowe rose from her seat near the side wall, uniform crisp, expression resolute. She nodded at me once, an unspoken cue. The conflicted witness was no longer conflicted. She had stepped fully into her role, and this was the moment her testimony mattered most. I cleared my throat and turned toward the crowd. My car didn't catch fire because of a malfunction, I began. It was ignited intentionally, and every piece of evidence supports that. The enforcer in crimson shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward the exit. I've completed a full forensic sweep, I continued. Burn patterns, fuel traces, temperature differentials, material remains. I lifted the small evidence bag containing the charred cotton fibers. And all of it leads back to one place. Dozens of heads turned toward Valerie simultaneously. Her breath hitched loudly enough for the first two rows to hear. The board chair finally spoke, her voice fragile. "You're making dangerous accusations." "No," I replied calmly. "I'm presenting facts." I clicked my remote, projecting the first image onto the screen behind me, a close-up of the scorch trail. Gasps echoed through the room as the arc illuminated in stark detail. I advanced to the next slide, ignition points, highlighted with thermal analysis. The clipboard queen's lips parted in horror. The tyrant in heels squeezed her temples. The officer of rules looked physically ill. Then came the final slide. The cotton fibers near Valerie's trash bin. A wave of whispers surged through the audience like a rising tide. Jenna stepped forward. "I have additional information," she said. The room snapped into silence. A 911 call was made around the time of the fire. The caller was young, panicked, and calling from the Storm residence. Chaos broke loose. Gasps, shouts, questions shouted over one another. Valerie stood abruptly, palms pressed to the table. "You have no proof, my son." "I'm not naming your son," Jenna said evenly. "I'm stating where the call originated." The room erupted again. I raised my hand, and surprisingly, the room quieted. "This isn't about punishing a child," I said softly. "This is about accountability, and about the consequences the HOA has brought upon all of us by hiding the truth." I let the weight of that settle. Every homeowner knew what financial disaster meant for a neighborhood like ours. "Insurance will classify this as deliberate ignition," I continued, "and that triggers federal reporting, which triggers federal penalties." "How high?" someone yelled. $7 million, I replied. A stunned silence swallowed the room whole. Valerie's knees buckled, and she sank back into her chair. The enforcer in crimson covered her mouth. The clipboard queen closed her eyes. The tyrant in heels began to cry quietly. The officer of rules stared blankly at the floor, her world unraveling faster than she could process. Jenna stepped beside me. We will proceed with the required investigations. The board chair finally looked up at me, tears streaking her cheeks. Please, don't ruin him. I met her gaze evenly. I'm not ruining anyone. I'm letting the truth speak. And as the room exploded into debate, outrage, fear, and fractured loyalty, one thing became painfully clear. Tonight wasn't the end. It was the reckoning Ridgewood Bluffs had been avoiding for years. The room didn't settle. Even after the shouting tapered into strained murmurs, the tension clung to the walls like smoke. People shifted in their seats, whispering fears they'd never imagined facing. And at the center of it all sat Valerie Storm, shoulders caved inward, the board chair no longer the towering presence she once used to command every meeting. Her eyes were red, swollen, and fixed on the table in front of her. The enforcer in crimson leaned toward her, as if trying to hold her upright. But even she looked hollowed out, the weight of their unraveling authority sinking into her bones. I stepped back from the projector, letting the final image fade. This was the closing moment, the culmination of every burn pattern, every piece of evidence, every crack in the Storm family's facade, and the room knew it. Even the clipboard queen held her binder limply, no longer pretending it contained rules strong enough to shield them. The tyrant in heels wiped her tears with trembling fingers, mascara streaking her cheeks. The officer of rules stared ahead blankly, like someone waking from a long illusion. Officer Jenna Rowe remained beside me, her expression firm but sympathetic. She wasn't reveling in the confrontation. She was respecting it. She'd chosen the truth, and standing up to the HOA had cost her something internally. But it also brought clarity she'd avoided for too long. I cleared my throat. Before we go any further, I said, I want everyone to understand something. This wasn't about vengeance. This wasn't about ego. It was about safety, truth, and accountability. Someone in the second row nodded slowly, and a few murmurs of agreement followed. When my father passed, I continued, I kept his car not because it was expensive, but because it was the last project we ever finished together. It represented him, his craftsmanship, his legacy, his lessons about paying attention when the world wants to look away. I glanced at the scorch photo again before turning back to the room. Someone tried to erase that, and the HOA tried to erase the truth about who did it. The enforcer in crimson flinched. Valerie looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. I was trying to protect him, she whispered. He was scared. I know, I replied softly. And that's why federal restitution laws exist, to get minors help, not to destroy them. But covering it up, lying, manipulating neighbors, that made things worse. Silence thickened again. Jenna stepped forward. Here's what happens next, she said. The evidence Marcus collected will be submitted to both insurance and fire investigators. They'll determine the level of liability. But because this involves deliberate ignition, reporting is mandatory. The clipboard queen looked down, defeated. The HOA board will need to cooperate fully, Jenna continued. Federal investigators will request interviews, documentation, and gate camera access. The officer of rules opened her mouth as if to protest, but nothing came out. A resident stood. So, the HOA pays the penalties? That depends, I answered. If the board participated in concealment or obstruction, the HOA becomes liable. That means increased dues, emergency assessments, lawsuits, and disciplinary action. Gasps filled the room, fearful, shocked, resigned. And if the HOA refuses cooperation, Jenna added, the consequences multiply. The tyrant in heels sank deeper into her seat. The enforcer in crimson rubbed her face. And Valerie Storm. She just stared at her trembling hands, the weight of decisions she couldn't undo pressing down on her. One neighbor raised his voice hesitantly. What about your son? I took a breath. He'll have to participate in the process, but if he cooperates, if he's honest, if he takes responsibility, he'll be given options. Restitution programs, counseling, mandated safety courses, alternatives designed for minors. Valerie's silent tears finally spilled freely. This doesn't have to destroy him, I said gently, but continuing to hide the truth will. The board chair's shoulders sagged, the last of her resistance collapsing into raw exhaustion. She nodded slowly, not to me, but to herself, as if accepting the reality she'd fought so desperately to outrun. Residents began speaking again, this time not in panic, but in recognition. They'd seen the truth, felt it, finally understood the stakes, and the shift in their expressions told me everything. Ridgewood Bluffs would never let this board operate unchecked again. I looked back at the crowd. I'll keep everyone updated as investigators move forward, and if you've ever been intimidated, silenced, or threatened by this HOA, now is the time to come forward. Dozens, of faces softened with relief. I stepped away from the podium, letting the moment settle, and then, in a calm voice meant for every viewer who'd ever felt powerless in their own neighborhood, I spoke the final CTA, firm, honest, and earned. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now, share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. The room erupted, not with chaos this time, but with something that had been missing for years: accountability, truth, and the beginning of change.